I'm going to give you an overview today of some of the work that we've been doing, and as Richard explained, I'm going to try to cover the lifespan and concentrate on older age. But I'm going to begin with the most important thing, something that's really much more important than this. There it is. Because I bet you haven't had a chance to see it, right? Richard, this is the wedding dress. There she is. Now, as you know, early this morning in Britain, the now Duchess of Cambridge got married. In the Globe and Mail this morning, that I read on the way here, they had asked advice from experts of various types on what Kate should now wear, what she should now do, how she should now behave. And one expert had the following advice. Kate's top priority should be to learn French. And if she does, and if she learns it effectively, then she can join the ranks of those that we call bilingual. What do we mean by bilingual? Here's a rather extreme example. The brothers David and Arya had brought 3 languages with them from Odessa. At home they had spoken Russian and Yiddish, in the street Russian, and at the Zionist kindergarten they had learned to speak Hebrew. Here in Vilna they added Greek and Latin, Polish, German, and French. Later in the European Literature department at the university, English and Italian were added to the list, and in the Semitic philology department, my father also learned Arabic, Aramaic, and cuneiform writing. This is from the memoir of Amos Oz, and he's describing the life of his father and uncle. They were 2 brothers. That's extreme. We don't have to achieve that level of multilingualism, but that is entirely within the normal human experience and possibility. So what I'm going to talk about today is how bilingualism as a normal human experience has a sustained effect on rewiring cognitive systems in the brain. Everything we do rewires the brain, everything. Your brain is simply a sponge that soaks up all of your past experiences and responds to them by reconfiguring itself. So it's constantly being restructured. Now, the literature usually talks about this restructuring in 2 different terms. One is what I'm going to call mind. And this is evidence from behavioral studies. So we know, for example, that architects do better than non-architects on visual-spatial tasks. And video game players do better than non-video game players on all sorts of hand-eye coordination tasks. None of that is surprising, because those outcomes are contained within the experience. Maybe you become an architect because you have a special talent in that domain. So you can't really figure out how the experience is rewiring the brain. Similarly, there's the other side of it, what I call brain changes. And these are experiences that actually change the structure, the physical structure of the brain. So we know that musicians who are string players, professional string players, now if you play a string instrument, you use the 4 fingers on your left hand. And if you look in the brains of professional string players, the part of the brain where the information from those 4 fingers is recorded is larger. Okay, it's not surprising again. And then the most famous example is London taxi drivers. To become a taxi driver in London, you need to memorize what they call the knowledge. And the knowledge is the roadmap of London, every cul-de-sac, every alleyway, everything. And so then when you look in the brains of London taxi drivers, we find that they have an enlarged area in the hippocampus that's responsible for spatial navigation. Again, not surprising. So bilingualism is, like all of these other examples, an intense experience. Does it modify the mind and brain? And what I'll propose, I'll come back to this point later, but the reason that bilingualism is much more interesting than all of those other experiences is that bilinguals are not pre-selected. It's the only case where you can really look objectively at how the experience has an effect on the mind and brain and not just pre-selects for expertise. Okay, I'd forgotten that I have this and I don't have to stand there and walk around, right? Well, push the right one. I should have just stuck to the mouse because it was working, right? Okay. Here is the central argument. Is it this one? Okay, thanks. That's the left one. Okay. All right, here's the central argument. This sounds counterintuitive, but in all of psychology, there are few statements that reach the level of consensus of this one. If you are a bilingual and there are two languages that you know quite well and you use regularly, when you speak one of them, the other one is also active. And that is almost beyond dispute at this point. So if you speak another language that has absolutely no bearing on where you are and who you're speaking to, you can be in a different country, there's no possibility that anyone in the room knows this other language, it is still active in your mind when you're using the language you're speaking. You see, this really doesn't work, does it? Back to the mouse. It's okay. I'll just use the mouse. It's okay. So there's a lot of it. I'll just use the mouse. It's much easier. All right. Yeah, thanks. This means that for a bilingual, it works for you.
You have to touch here. Just touch here and here. Not there, not there. Just here.
Okay. I'll try it again. All right. All right, this means that if you're a bilingual, you have a problem that a monolingual doesn't have, and the problem is selection. Because we want to, when we speak, our mind is sort of sampling from a complex linguistic representation. And if you have two activated and therefore competing representations, the additional problem faced by the bilingual is a problem of selection and possibly within the face of competition. That's a problem. Otherwise, how do you keep this activated but non-relevant language from intruding into speech? And bilinguals do this. Your other language doesn't infiltrate, even though it's active. So the competition from the other language means that language processing, language speech, language comprehension for bilinguals is more effortful and takes place in a context that requires a different kind of processing. And I've listed here some of the evidence. Bilinguals are slower to retrieve words, slower to name pictures. They have more tip-of-the-tongue experiences, reduced verbal fluency, and I'm going to talk more about that later. This is just a simple problem where you have to generate words as quickly as you can. So simple language selection for a bilingual takes place in a context that's more effortful, and therefore language processing has to be done in a different way. Here's a sort of cartoon diagram. Imagine that these are the two activated language systems of a bilingual. So you're only trying to use language 1. Language 2 is equally activated. And so the process of producing language takes place in the context of conflict. So you have the L2 equivalent competing for attention. Don't take this diagram literally at all. It really is just a cartoon to explain that there's this overall situation of competition. So that kind of conflict leads to reduced lexical access. And that's the basic finding in that list of results that I showed you, slower times for picture naming and so forth. But there's another aspect to it as well. Typically, bilinguals have a smaller vocabulary in each language than an otherwise equivalent monolingual speaker. I'm not saying that bilinguals know fewer words. I'm certainly not saying that every bilingual has a smaller vocabulary than every monolingual, but on average, this is what we find. So I can show you two data sets. In all the research we do, we give the subjects in our studies the PPVT test for receptive vocabulary in English. It's a standardized test, and it's normalized around a mean score of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So on average, the population mean will follow a normal distribution with those characteristics. Because we use this test all the time, a couple of years ago, we aggregated the results from over 1,700 children between the ages of 3 and 10, because sometimes you do a study and the monolinguals score better, sometimes the bilinguals do as well. But these are little studies with 25 kids in a group, and you don't really know what the population distribution is like. But with over 1,700 subjects, you can look at distributions in the population. In all our studies, these subjects are matched on cognitive measures, they're matched on social class measures. So these are monolingual and bilingual children who are equivalent on everything except the bilingual children don't speak English at home. That's the typical result. That's what we find. So what you see here is two perfectly normal distributions, remarkably normal. There's the mean of 100 for the population, and you can see there's just a little shift. The monolinguals are slightly above the population mean, and the bilinguals are slightly below the population mean. But all of this area here, it could be a monolingual with a higher score or bilingual with a higher score, but that's the pattern we find in a matched sample of the population. On average, monolinguals have higher vocabularies in each language. We recently repeated this exercise with adults. This time it's over 1,600 adults in the sample, and get more or less the same result. It's a little less pretty. There's a bit of a dip there, but statistically it's identical. So we can say that on average, the bilingual representation for each language is a bit less rich. So if we go back to this cartoon diagram, we have a second problem to deal with, gaps. So to look at what selection is like, we might have a situation now where the bilingual is trying to select from the L1, but faces reduced choice. And that too compromises lexical access. So together, this is a way of saying that lexical selection is effortful, both because of the conflict from two activated systems and because of the gaps in representation through reduction. That's the problem. Bilinguals have to solve this problem in lexical access. And how they solve it is that they recruit the executive control system. So executive control is a set of cognitive processes that are distributed through the brain, but always starting from the frontal cortex, from the very front of the brain, and then extending backwards into various regions. It is the most important cognitive system. It develops last in children, and it declines first with aging. You don't want to know how early it starts declining. It's way too depressing. People talk about components of the executive control system, and there's three that are usually referred to. Inhibition, I'm going to show you examples of each of these. Inhibition, shifting, and working memory. So the idea is that this system is designed to resolve conflict, to focus attention. That's what it does. And so when the language system runs into conflict and has a problem in attention, it says, okay, executive control system, you're on, solve this for me. That means that